Welcome. We're so glad you're here with us for today's Harper Lecture. The Harper Lecture series began in 1979 with Hannah Holborn Gray speaking in San Francisco. As the need for critical thought remains apparent in all areas of life, we proudly continue this signature program to bring you stimulating conversations and fresh ideas. Our UChicago community is a global one, and we are thrilled that technology can help us stay connected to one another. As you enjoy today's lecture, please note the following items. Your camera and video will be off. However, we encourage you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask a question at any time during the talk. Closed captions are available by clicking the box at the bottom of your screen. Click Show Subtitles to enable this feature. If you're having trouble with audio or video, please try shutting down programs in the background, or you can dial in from your phone. Thank you once more for joining us. We couldn't do this without you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Harper Lecture, Why So Many Americans Believe in So Many Crazy Things, with Professor Eric Oliver. I'm Andrea Hodgman, Interim Director of Alumni Engagement and the Program Manager for the Harper Lecture Series. On behalf of everyone at the UChicago Alumni Office, thank you for joining us. Please allow me to introduce our moderator. Andrew McCall is a Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on what would need to happen for racial inequality in U.S. policing to be eliminated. Dr. McCall's dissertation used agency theory to examine the consequences of increasing bureaucratic independence for the trajectory of racial inequality in arrests during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He chose this historical period because it saw national attention to and grassroots activism around the issue of racism in policing and significant changes to the methods, training, and oversight of U.S. police departments. Professor Oliver, Dr. McCall, thank you both for joining us. Dr. McCall, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Eric this evening. So Eric Oliver is a professor in the political science department here at the University of Chicago. His award-winning books and widely cited articles deal with US public opinion, political psychology, local politics, and racial attitudes. I think though, above all, he's an intellectual who spends his time asking and is, to the extent as humanly possible, answering interesting questions. His early work dealt with place and politics in really cool ways. He wrote a book on the politics of American suburbs, which are these places where so many Americans live, but so few social scientists think about studying in a rigorous way. And he had early papers also on the contextual determinants of racial attitudes. Then some of his more recent work has strayed from the beaten path again in political science, examining the role of what he calls magical thinking, the belief in the causal processes and actors often associated with magic and the divine intervention in the formation and change of mass public opinion. So if you leave this evening's lecture wishing you'd gotten to take his course at the University of Chicago, I've got good news for you. He's launching a podcast entitled 9 Questions. I think it drops in April. Which is based off of a course he's been teaching here for the last 20 years or so, about how we know ourselves. On a more personal note, I first met Eric my first year of grad school when he presented at UC Berkeley, where we both did our PhDs, at our research workshop. And he presented, I think, earlier material from this book that he might tell us a little bit more about. And it was a breath of fresh air in a period of socialization where we're supposed to be learning about sort of the serious questions of Congress, the presidency. Eric walks up and he starts talking about magical thinking, and sort of showing how you can take these observations about the crazy things your uncles say and tease out and systematize their impacts on politics in a way that was both unexpected and hilarious. So with all of you, I'm looking forward to enjoying this evening's lecture. And without further ado, here's Eric.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's great to see you, and thanks for the very welcoming introduction. I'm going to go right to my talk here. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to come and listen to me try to explain to you why so many Americans believe in so many crazy things. And this talk, I'm going to start with something that happened 20 years ago. As all of you are very familiar with this image, it's of course the Twin Towers on 9/11. And most people, when they understand what happened on this day, understand that it was the result of a group of terrorists who hijacked 2 planes, crashing them into the World Trade Center. There were 2 more planes they hijacked, one of which crashed into the Pentagon, one of which crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. These were terrorists affiliated with Al-Qaeda and basically acting independently as a part of this sort of larger global terrorist effort. At least this was the conclusion of the 9/11 Commission report. But when you go out and you ask people, ordinary Americans, what they think happened on 9/11, a lot of them have a very different explanation. For example, if you ask people the question whether or not they agree with the statement, a small number of government officials secretly planned the attacks of September 11th because they wanted America to go to war in the Middle East, about 20% agree with this. And it's not just 9/11 conspiracy theories that we see a lot of support for. When we ask people, for example, do you believe there's a small secret cabal that controls world events? Around 35% of people typically say yes. About a third of people believe Jeff Epstein was murdered on the orders of powerful people. Anywhere from 40 to 50% of people believe that the Food and Drug Administration is not approving natural cures for cancer because of secret pressure from the pharmaceutical industry. And about 30% of Americans think that COVID is a result of a secret government conspiracy as well. Now, the interesting thing for me about this is when I started doing research on conspiracy theories, and this was around 2006, I was not expecting numbers this big. And I was really shocked. And when I showed it to some of my political science colleagues, they couldn't really believe it either. And we kept running surveys again and again, and we kept seeing these really, really big numbers of people who were believing in conspiracy theories. And so our next question was, well, what's going on with this? Why are people believing in these kind of really outlandish sort of explanations for political events? And what could be predicting this? And what we found was that one of the biggest predictors of whether or not people lived in conspiracy theories is whether or not they had a lot of supernatural and paranormal beliefs. And it turns out Americans have a lot of supernatural and paranormal beliefs. About 70% of us believe in angels. About 55% of us believe in Satan, about 73% in ESP, and about 42% in ghosts. And it's just not these phenomena. Americans really are not very enthusiastic about science, it turns out. More than half of Americans don't believe in Darwinian evolution. About 30% think that eliminating gluten will make you healthier. More recently, about a quarter of Americans think that COVID vaccines are unnecessary and dangerous. And about 40% of Americans think that dinosaurs and humans coexisted. Now, what's really interesting to me when I was sort of surveying through all of these various beliefs is that they're all highly correlated with one another. So the likelihood that you believe in a conspiracy theory was very, very correlated with the likelihood of believing in angels, which was very correlated with the idea that, say, dinosaurs and humans coexisted. Then the 2016 election happened. And this even got a little bit more interesting because we had this unlikely character who managed to seize hold of the Republican nomination and, more interestingly, grabbed the imagination and the enthusiasm of a lot of evangelical Christians, even though he was somebody who did not have a lot of firm Christian convictions himself. And this is, of course, Donald Trump. So this was, as a political scientist, this was very, very perplexing to me. And as a social scientist, it was even more perplexing because if you went back 100 years past, Max Weber, who was one of the founders of sociology, one of the great thinkers of the social sciences, he basically predicted that we were becoming disenchanted. The superstitions, the magical beliefs of the medieval era were being displaced by the cool rationality of modern science, of logical deduction. And I think Max Weber would probably say, what is going on? This would seem completely inexplicable to him. And so that became intriguing for me. Why were Americans still so enchanted? Why, instead of seeing the world through this lens of logic, deduction, fact, and reason, they instead saw the world in more terms like this, or this, or this. A world that was filled with metaphor and symbol. a world that was filled with prophecy and potency, a world that really seemed to be detached from the kind of rational scientific basis that we were expecting this country to have, and in particularly in a country as educated and affluent as the United States. So this is really what began this entire project. And the answer that I came away with is that Americans aren't simply divided by party. They're not simply divided by ideology. They're not simply divided by race. They're divided by worldview. And I would say this division in worldview is really on this continuum with people on one side who I would call intuitionists. And these are people who believe in myth and metaphor, kind of in symbol and emotions. And on the other side are what we would call rationalists. And these are people who I would say before believe in logic, fact, deduction, and reason. Now, obviously, most people have combinations of intuitionist and rationalist proclivities. The people who are distinctly on one end of the spectrum and the other are few in number. But what I'm going to hopefully show to you today is that where somebody is on this spectrum can say a lot about their political beliefs, and it can say a lot about what's actually happening in American politics today, and why that person at your family Thanksgiving dinner may be so hard to talk to. And I'll try to explain a little bit about maybe what you can do to talk to them. And this is fully outlined in a book that was published a few years ago with my former graduate student, Tom Wood, called Enchanted America. A lot of what I'll be saying is explicated in the book. I encourage you to go out and get it. It's a good read. But what I want to argue here is when we typically think about politics, what we think about is Americans sort of aligned on this kind of liberal conservative ideological spectrum. And what I think is also interesting and particularly perilous for American democracy right now is something else that's going on. Because I would say there's this other spectrum, which I would say is intuitionists versus rationalists. And for a long time, this other spectrum was completely orthogonal to ideology. It was just as easy to find liberal intuitionists as it was conservative rationalists. In fact, I am old enough to remember now when conservatives really prided themselves on their rationalism, and there was a hard-headed conservatism as opposed to that kind of soft-hearted liberalism. But in reality, most people, just as most people are on the center of the ideological spectrum, I think most people are kind of in the center of the intuitionism spectrum. But over the past 30 years, this has begun to switch. And instead of seeing a distribution that looks like this, we're beginning to see a distribution that looks like this, where conservative politics and the conservative movement is increasingly becoming dominated by an intuitionist perspective. It's actually animated and fueled by a type of rhetoric and a type of speech and rationale that really draws on gut feelings, that draws on myth, that draws on symbols. And meanwhile, you're seeing on the left a more explicit embracing of a scientific and rationalist ideology that's being oriented on that lines. And, and we can see this, like, for example, after the most recent presidential election, where we had, groups of people praying outside of the Arizona Board of Elections, praying for the election to be overturned. And then on the other side, this is a sign that is very common to see in a liberal neighborhood like Hyde Park, where it's the list of liberal ideological talking points. And of course, one of the main points is that science is real, and this embrace of science is real. And I think it's not this, what often looks like an ideological shift in the United States and what looks like an ideological divide is less a matter of ideology and as much a matter of a worldview. So let me try to explain a little bit about what's going on with that worldview. So most of the people I speak to probably are college educated and pride themselves on their rationality. And so one of the big challenges is always how to talk to people, for example, who don't share a rationalist framework or a rationalist way of understanding the world. And we've seen this probably most recently over the past couple of years with COVID and resistance to COVID vaccines. and the debates around mask mandates and COVID vaccinations and all of these things. And there are just some groups of people who are really, really resistant to what the science is saying about the efficacy of COVID vaccines and the importance of COVID vaccination. And one of the questions is, how do we understand what's going on with these folks? How might we communicate with them? And the way to understand this is try to understand what is it that informs our intuitions. And to do this, let me just say what an intuition is. An intuition is when we make a judgment with a limited amount of information. And so we're having to draw on our own innate tendencies and our innate strategies for coming up with an answer. And if we're trying to understand intuitions, what really stood out for me was going back and thinking about the number of people who had strong intuitionist tendencies, who had a lot of supernatural or paranormal beliefs. And that led me to think about magical thinking. And there's actually a very rich literature in psychology and anthropology about magical thinking. And so I went and kind of dove into that literature, and I came away from that literature with two ideas about really what drives intuitions. And the first idea came from this guy. This is Bronislaw Malinowski, who was one of the founders of anthropology. Here he is with the Trobriand Islanders, and this is about 100 years ago. And he was fascinated with magical thinking and magical beliefs. And he went to this really remote island, and the Trobriand Islanders seemed to live in very primitive conditions, and their culture was just filled with superstitions and filled with myths. And of course, Europeans tended to, at this time, look down on such cultures as the sign of their myth making and their superstitions, as a sign of their intellectual inferiority. And Malinowski, when he got there, said that was just not the case. These were people who had come up with an enormous array of really amazing technological solutions to problems in their environment. They were very, very attuned to their natural surroundings. They were very intelligent. But rather, he saw that their magical beliefs were tools for them. And one of the things that they were tools for them were basically, they were probably what we would think of as, psychotropic medicine. Now, they were ways of managing uncomfortable emotions. And I think this is the first thing that we need to understand about intuitions, is that our intuitions are basically there to help us with process our emotions. They're very much informed by emotions, and they're very much in response to emotions. And so let me explain this. Like, most of the time, we exist in a place of kind of homeostasis, emotionally speaking. We tend to sort of stay in a pretty emotional state, particularly if there's no uncertainty or threat in our immediate environment. Here we can just kind of operate. However, if something threatening suddenly appears for us, our adrenaline goes up, our heart rate goes up, we see the threat, and we're highly motivated to act on this. And this is really what emotions are. Emotions are motivational states for us. In this case, we can call this fear. We see something that's threatening, and fear is motivating us to do something, which is to eliminate the threat. And if we find ourselves, we just basically run away. Eventually, we come back to our emotional homeostatic set point. And so this is in some ways what magical beliefs basically do for us. When we encounter things that have a high degree of risk and a high degree of uncertainty, like, say, for example, deep sea fishing, we see this in war, we see this in baseball, which is replete with a lot of superstitions. And of course, the big uncertainty, which is death, all of these things generate in us an enormous amount of apprehension, an enormous amount of anxiety, and we seek to cope with that anxiety by trying to come up with belief systems that rationalize it or make it go away. Now, here what we have is, in the case of 9/11, something similar. We had this extraordinary activity happen. There was a great threat to the United States. We were under attack, enormous amount of anxiety across the country. And how do some people cope with this anxiety? They embrace a conspiracy theory. There's a conspiracy theory that's available to them. And the conspiracy theory does two things, one of which is it helps explain what's going on. So at least in the short run, it helps ameliorate some level of anxiety, but it does something else. And this is, I think, really important when we start thinking about the prevalence of conspiracy theories in a modern American political discourse, they also, in some ways, rationalize a chronic anxiety that's always there. Because think about it, if you actually think that the government would be so nefarious to blow up the World Trade Center and kill thousands of its own citizens just to prompt a war, halfway across the world, and you're still living under that government, that's a scary place to be. And so, ironically, even though conspiracy theories give us a sense of order, they help sustain a certain level of anxiety that's always there. And this is one of the most important things about intuitions is that they conflate internal feelings with external reality. And the way I like to illustrate this is my son Ethan when he was 5. And one night he was really scared. He was screaming and crying. I ran into his room and he said, Dad, there are monsters in my closet, monsters in my closet. So I turned on the light, I opened the closet, I showed him, we went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I said, I was just trying to rationalize him. I was like, listen, there are no monsters in your room. And he's turned to me and he said, well, Dad, if there are no monsters in the closet, then why am I afraid? And I was like, okay, you got me. But that's basically the logic of intuitions. We draw on our anxieties, we draw on our apprehensions in particular. We can draw on other emotions as well, but oftentimes it's really these apprehensions and anxieties that then we are seeking to rationalize in some ways. And so we're drawn to beliefs and we're drawn to explanations that accord with those deep and chronic feelings of uncertainty. Now, the second thing that's to know about intuitions is they actually have kind of a grammar to them. And I got this insight from one of the other pioneers in anthropology, Sir James Frazer. And in the late 19th century, he collected reports from missionaries and colonial administrators around the world and amassed this great compendium of religious and magical beliefs called the Golden Bough. And one of the things that Frazer noted about all of these magical beliefs is that they had some core similarities. And he said this kind of core kind of magic to them. And one of which is what we might call like a representative kind of magic. And this is emblematic of like a voodoo doll. So we think that we have a voodoo doll or an effigy of somebody, and that somehow or another actually connects with the actual person themselves. And so anything that represents something is not simply just a mere representation, but a direct connection to them. And so like by poking the voodoo doll with pins, we might be able to hurt the real person represented by the voodoo doll. The other thing that's common across magical beliefs worldwide is this idea of contagion. So if we go to the tainted place, if we go to the impure place, we are then defiled and we have to come back and do some sort of purification ritual here. Or similarly, if we're able to touch the holy shrine, or we're able to touch the hem of the Pope's skirt, that we receive those blessings, that those things then come onto us. And interestingly, I think these ideas, his identifications, presaged what psychologists now called heuristics. And heuristics are these cognitive shortcuts that we use for making decisions. When we don't have a lot of information and we need to make a judgment, we have these innate judgment tendencies in our head that allow us to make these types of shortcuts. So for example, there's an idea of a representativeness heuristic. And this means typically it's like the voodoo doll, that we think that things that sort of look like other things share core characteristics with them. There's the contagion heuristic. We think that like if you are in contact with something that's bad, you have somehow or another been tainted. Something that's very common with a lot of conspiracy theories is an anthropomorphizing heuristic. We think that something that moves or that causes things to happen must have a human-like intentionality. So you see this a lot when people say, oh, the CIA wants to do X, or the US government wants to do X, as if it's a single person with a single intention to it. And to show you how these kind of heuristics work, I'll put in some of the experiments that I did for the book to kind of test this out. So one experiment is I asked people, I said, imagine that you're locked in a room and the key to get out of the room is hidden under one of these objects. Now, you should also know that one of these objects is really dangerous and should be avoided at all cost. Which object do you think is most dangerous? And if you ask children this, they immediately say C, because children are just great intuitive thinkers. And if you ask most people in national surveys, more than half say C. And of course, why is that? Well, this is the idea of the representativeness heuristic. The object in the middle, of course, resembles a spider, and most of us have an innate fear or phobia of spiders. So barring any other kind of information, we're going to draw on that, and we're going to assume that, oh, okay, the spider-looking object is the one to be avoided. Interestingly, the one that's the least dangerous is the little egg-shaped one there, and I'm not really sure ever what to make of that, but obviously, if you want to sabotage someone, that's the one to go with. I'll give you another example of how intuitions embody these heuristics. We gave people the following scenario. We said, suppose a friend told you that he won a $5,000 lottery by rubbing his ticket on and for half the sample, we said a paper napkin. And said, so, you know, he won a lottery by rubbing his ticket on a paper napkin. Would you give it a try? The other half of the sample, we asked the same question, except instead of a paper napkin, we said a dollar bill. And we said, would you give that a try? And sure enough, the proportion of the sample that got the paper napkin prompt, about 40% said, yeah, of course, I'll rub a lottery ticket on a paper napkin. Sure, why not? But the proportion that got the dollar bill prompt, close to 60% said that they would do that. And if you think about it, of course that makes sense. Of course, it's going to be a lot more effective to rub a lottery ticket on a dollar bill than a paper napkin. So this gives you an idea how these intuitions work. So the question then that we had was, how do we measure intuitions? And particularly, how do we measure this propensity to rely on intuitions without invoking specific beliefs? And we knew that intuitions rely on our emotions, and particularly anxiety are very important. And we knew that intuitions draw on these heuristics. So we came up with a series of survey measures to try to evoke and sort of differentiate people by where they stood on their emotions. And I'll go through some of them here. And for the first group, we basically asked people a series of paired questions that were as follows. We said, would you rather stab a photograph of your family with a sharp knife or stick your hand in a bowl of cockroaches? Would you rather yell, I hope I die tomorrow out loud 5 times, or ride in a speeding car without a seatbelt? Would you rather sleep in laundry pajamas, once worn by Charles Manson, or put a nickel in your mouth that you found on the ground? Would you rather grind your shoes into an unmarked grave or stand in line for 3 hours at the DMV? And finally, would you rather spend the night in a luxurious house where the family was recently murdered, or spend the night in a dingy bus station? Now, you can probably get a sense of where these questions are going. We're basically here posing something that we would say is a symbolic cost, which is it invokes a heuristic. And it's not saying that it's costless, but its cost really comes from the emotional connotations. You know, it would make me uncomfortable to stab a photo of my family with a sharp knife, versus something that actually has a tangible cost, which is, yes, it will make me feel very uncomfortable to put my hand in a bowl of cockroaches. And what we see basically is that Americans kind of divide across all of these. I think the one that people are least likely to want to do is to sleep in laundry pajamas by that Charles Manson, or grind their shoes in an unmarked grave. When it comes to things like, you know, stabbing photo family versus sticking hands in cockroaches, we get about 50-50 on that. But what we're basically doing here is the more that people accept a tangible cost and stay away from a symbolic cost, the more they're going to be scoring higher on our intuition scale. We also asked a couple of other scales here. We asked, for example, what we call the apprehension scale. And this was how often people did things to sort of, you know, ensure their security. So like checking the locks on their doors and windows, washing their hands with antibacterial soap, shredding bills before they throw them away, these types of things. And you can see the distributions here. Most people do these types of things, either report doing these types of things either often or always. But we can still get a nice kind of distribution here in terms of these activities. And then the last thing that we asked about was a pessimism scale, or what we call a pessimism scale. Now, we were asking these survey items in 2015 and 2016. And we asked about 4 items that we said, okay, these are all things that could likely happen. And we wanted to get a sense of how likely people think that they would happen. And so we asked about a recession, we asked about a terrorist attack, and we asked about 2 things now that are looking more likely: an outbreak of a major infectious disease in the United States, and a war against China or Russia in the next 5 years. And here again, we got a scale. And the idea when we were doing these is, of course, these are things that may happen, but we wanted to get a sense of someone's anxiety levels and their pessimism and their sense that something bad was actually on the way. And what we found is when we take all of these 3 scales together, they highly, highly correlated with each other, and we can put them together in one scale that we call an apprehension scale. Now, this is the part of the talk where I'm going to talk about statistics. And I have to sort of say here, when I'm on a plane and I'm sitting next to somebody, and if I'm feeling chatty and they say, what do you do? I say, oh, I teach political science, and we inevitably start talking about politics and we have a great conversation. If I'm not feeling chatty, I say, oh, I teach statistics, which is also true. And the conversation stops right there. So I'm going to take us into some statistics. I know that's something that is very off-putting for a lot of people, but I'm going to try to make this as palatable as I can and get through this as quickly as I can. So just bear with me here. Anyway, so I had this Intuitionism scale here that we put together, and we have a distribution that looks like this. And as a social scientist, when we see these kind of normal looking distributions here, something that looks similar like a bell curve, we get very, very excited, because this means, oh, okay, we have something that looks pretty good here. And what's remarkable about this Intuitionism scale is not simply the distribution here, but then its predictive power. So when we ask people, say, for example, things about, let's just talk about some supernatural beliefs. Do they think that the Bible is the literal word of God, or that we're living in biblical end times, or that problems can be solved by prayer? What we see is just remarkable changes along the Intuitionism scale. And remember, the Intuitionism scale is not asking about anything specifically religious here. It's really trying to tap into anxiety, apprehension, and an appetite for these types of heuristics. But sure enough, we see these just dramatic differences in these types of supernatural beliefs relative to people's intuitionism. We also see this with paranormal phenomena. So ghosts, reincarnation, the power of positive thinking. All of these things are much, much higher among people who score higher on our Intuitionism scale. Conversely, we see that intuitionists are not big fans of Darwinian evolution. And they're much more populist in their sense of just knowledge bases. So they think common wisdom is better than expertise, that the heart is a better guide than the head. They even think things like, plants and trees can actually sense our feelings. So one of the things then, so we had the scale and we felt pretty good about this. It's like, okay, this is a scale that we think is really tapping into this sense of intuitionism that we think is out there. What we then wanted to do is look at a set of political beliefs that were out there. And so we put together a bunch of different measures of both conspiracy theories and put those together into a scale, and populist beliefs and put those into a scale. And populism was very interesting because it has a component of there's a political populism, which is kind of mistrust in the state. There is a cultural populism, which is sort of mistrust of experts. And there's also just nationalism, which is a big component of populism, like pride in being an American. And what we see here, once again, is that the Intuitionism scale is just our most robust predictor of believing in conspiracy theories. It just, if you go from the bottom end of the scale to the top end of the scale, you're 3 times more likely to be believing in a conspiracy theory across that. On our populism scale, you're more than twice as likely to identify as a populist as you move up across our Intuitionism scale. At least this is, and I should say, these are models that are also controlling for things like age, education, race, gender, religious backgrounds. And so we are really trying to isolate intuitionism here as a predictor of a lot of these types of beliefs. And we find it to be a really, really robust predictor of these types of beliefs. And one of the things is when we were doing these surveys, it was in the midst of the 2016 presidential elections and during the primary elections. And we ran a survey and we were curious how it differentiated the political candidates by this. And we saw that Bernie Sanders were actually the least intuitive, scored lowest on the intuitionism scores amongst his supporters did. Clinton a little less so. And as we might predict, the two candidates, at least in the who are still viable during the March 2016 primaries, whose supporters scored highest in intuitionism, were Ben Carson and Donald Trump. So I could go through this, but I'm for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to kind of summarize our findings here. We find that intuitionists tend to be a lot more ethnocentric. They exhibit a lot more hostility and apprehension about immigrants. As I mentioned before, not surprisingly, they have a lot more, many more anti-scientific attitudes. And something I want to come back to in just a moment is that they also express a much more intolerance of civil liberties. And they're much less comfortable with things like free speech and tolerance and opposing viewpoints and compromise as a legitimate form of democratic discourse here. What we do see here, and I think this is, so I should backtrack a little bit. We were doing most of this research in 2014 through 2016. And we were also curious because we saw all of these health attitudes that were coming up. And so we asked about a lot of questions about suspicions of vaccines, support for bans on GMOs, genetically modified foods, the idea of embracing natural medicines, and our intuitionists scored really high on all of these as well. We didn't anticipate, of course, what was coming up. We had no idea, but we saw that there were these rumblings that were there on things that at the time didn't necessarily seem to have much of an ideological stamp to them. If anything, a lot of these kinds of health issues, at least in the simple days of 2015, were liberal issues. These were where our liberal intuitionists tended to be expressing themselves a lot more, were around these types of issues as much as anyone else. But then that begs the question, of course, who are the intuitionists? And once again, I want to say that all of us have tendencies towards intuitionism. We all have, we can all be susceptible to relying on our gut feelings. We can slip in our rationality. Similarly, even the most starry-eyed person can still be reasonable when brought to, proper information. So I think all of us, I don't want to give the impression that this is a dichotomous difference between, on the one hand, there are rationalists, on the other hand, there are intuitionists. This is a scale, and most people tend to congregate in the middle of the scale. But nevertheless, we do see some interesting differences in terms of people who are intuitionists. We basically find our intuitionists tend to be less educated. They tend to be less wealthy. They're more likely to be female. And this was the part that really leaped out for us. They were much more likely to be conservative. And I'll show you some of our distributions by ideology here. So these are ways of predicting where people would be in terms of where our sample distributions would lie on the ideological spectrum. On our left here, you can see we have going from very liberal up to liberal to moderate to conservative to very conservative in people's self-identification of where they are ideologically. And on the right, on the horizontal axis, we have our Intuitionism scale, and these shapes try to give us a sense of our distributions across these scales. And what you can see, and the numbers in the middle are our average points. And so you can see, for example, among people who identify themselves as very conservative, they would score on a 0 to 100 Intuitionism scale about a 61 on average. And compared to people who identify as liberal or very liberal, which are in the 36 to 38 range. But you'll probably also notice that people who are very liberal also have a wide distribution across the Intuitionism scale, just as people who are very conservative have a pretty wide distribution across the Intuitionism scale. So it's not like these are sort of clean predictions, but boy, when we look at these average differences, they're really strong. And these factors control for a whole host of things like church attendance, education, income, other attitudinal differences as well. So that then brings me back to this point. We were doing this research in 2016, and one of the things that we witnessed was the surprise ascendancy of Donald Trump against the Republican establishment to seize the nomination and then to go on and win the presidency. And Trump himself was an intuitionist par excellence. If you just look at Trump's speeches, if you look at the way he talks in the language of intuitionism. He says, I go with my gut, I trust my instincts. He himself, is very nervous about vaccines, about germs. He, I think, more so than any political candidate I have seen in my lifetime, really articulates the kind of intuitionist understanding of political life. And as I mentioned earlier, when intuitionism was basically orthogonal to, say, party politics or basic ideological politics, I don't think that was necessarily a problem. When it comes to when it becomes the kind of core defining principle of an ideological movement, which I think we've seen over the past 4 years at least, whereby modern conservatism has really become dominated by its intuitionist elements. The rationalist conservatives, which really were the gatekeepers of conservatives up until the 1990s, are now in the wilderness. Your Bill Kristols, your Charlie Sykes, these are people who have really found themselves on the outskirts of the modern conservative movement. And of course, then the problem is when you have a political movement that's dominated by an intuitionist fervor, intuitionists are not very amenable to regular democratic procedures. And then you end up getting something like you had on January 6th, where a group of people are convinced in their own beliefs and convinced in the righteousness of their own cause. And they are putting democracy at risk. And we've basically seen what we're seeing here. And I think the real threats to American democracy come not from conservatism per se. There's nothing, conservatism has always been something about sort of sustaining the status quo. It is about an intuitionism within the guise of conservatism that itself relies on myth and relies on conspiracy theory and misinformation and a cycle of news misinformation that then feeds on itself. So I'm going to go and stop here. I think it's time to open up for questions. Thank you very much for your attention to the talk.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and there's been a lot of interest in this, judging by the questions in the talk, in the chat here. One question I think that that has been on a lot of people's minds, and my own too, is whether we should think of this as a feature of a person's thinking that changes over time, and that therefore might change in the population sort of through time, or is this relatively fixed from childhood?
So we don't have a firm answer to that. What I can say to you is when we ask one of the other predictors of whether or not someone scores high on their Intuitionist scale, were they raised in a religiously conservative household? And one of the things that I think is important to understand about intuitionism is that we may have our intuitionist proclivities. I certainly have mine, but are we in cultural context? Are we in cultural institutions that reinforce those intuitionist ways of thinking? So if I'm in a kind of church, for example, that really reinforces, like a charismatic or a fundamentalist church that really reinforces intuitionism. If I'm in some sort of chat room or some subreddit that reinforces this, I'm going to kind of continue to bolster that way of thinking. We basically find that there's not a big difference across the age cycle. Age is not a very good predictor of whether or not somebody is intuitionist. But cultural context, both from childhood and where you are in adulthood, typically is a very big predictor. And we can think about, one of the things that happens when you go to college and when you get a post-secondary education, the reason our education effects are so strong is, our schools teach us rationality. Rationality is counterintuitive. A lot of what we do here at the University of Chicago and the science that we pursue oftentimes is very, very counterintuitive. And we have to learn to embrace a way of thinking about the world that doesn't rely on our gut feelings and doesn't rely on these mental shortcuts that we so readily employ.
Thank you. So I guess along similar lines, then I wonder, so U.S. history has been replete with religious revival movements from before U.S. independence, where people would gather in large numbers and there would be evidence of divine intervention or sort of within the community there at the revival. And so should we think of this as part of a cycle in U.S. history of sort of a greater institutional support for intuitionism that sometimes is going to intersect with politics in the way that we're seeing today and other times would not, or is this somehow distinct from these previous historical moments?
So religion has always been interwoven with American politics and interwoven in very interesting ways. So if you go back and you look at, for example, the abolitionist movement in the early 19th century, that was very, very much based around churches there. The same way with the temperance movement. In the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, once again, very much connected. But if you look at most of the history of the 20th century up until the 1980s, particularly evangelical Christians saw themselves as separate from politics. They wanted to keep religion out of the public sphere. This was in their private sphere. This was their private life. In the late 1970s and beginning into the 1980s, however, that changed. And I think a lot of the reason why that changed were there were a number of Supreme Court decisions that really began to mobilize conservative Christians. There were the obvious ones like banning prayer in public school or Roe v. Wade, but I think even less obvious are the ideas of like Brown v. Board of Education and saying that you could no longer have segregated schools. And for a lot of Southern evangelical Christians who sent their children to parochial schools, the idea of having an integrated parochial school conflicted with a lot of their racial priors. And so I think all of these things together really began to mobilize evangelical Christians into politics. And you had Republican leaders who saw this as a very powerful ally that they could mobilize on their behalf. There was the Southern strategy, which very much targeted these types of evangelicals. And so you've seen now the politicization of religion in a way that you've just never ever really seen before in American history. And when we talk about political parties in political science, we talk about anchor groups. And if you look at the Republican Party, the core anchor group right now is evangelical Christians. And evangelical Christians tend to also have a very kind of intuitionist understanding of politics as well. So that is one reason why the party has moved in that direction. And conservatism, particularly when we have the growth of very ideologically oriented media centers, and this really tracks with the end of the fair use laws in the end of the 1980s, the rise of syndicated radio, the rise of cable news, and now the rise of the internet, where we have these media sources that allow for a great polarization of viewpoints to be spread. This is kind of, I think, further contributed to this ideological polarization, but it's also furthered, I would say, this ontological polarization, whereby if I believe in just, if I believe, for example, that we're living in end times, and I go about and I think that everything is a potent symbol of the rapture, that it may be about a come. I want to feed it. I want to hear information that feeds into that, and so I'll probably go and get my information from like a religious television network. And so we begin seeing things like that in this confluence. And I think the politicization of a certain kind of conservative Christianity is just stronger now than it's ever been, and I think it's distinct to this time period.
Thank you. So a lot of us, myself included, are wondering, when we're at the dinner table with our uncle or relative or just good friend who thinks in these ways, what do we do? How do we engage productively in a dialogue with the person we care about who thinks very differently?
So this is the question that I get more than any other question, and it's the hardest question. And I have two kinds of answers for this that I've gone back to. The first answer, this was my first answer, and it went back to the slide I had of my son, because when I was trying to talk to my son, I couldn't reason with him. He was not going to go to sleep that night with me showing him that there was no monster, showing him facts. What he wanted me to hear was his anxiety. And the moment that I stopped and I said, "Oh, you're feeling afraid," and I said that your anxiety is warranted. I hear your anxiety. I understand where you're coming from, that you're feeling apprehensive here. Suddenly we're able to talk. We were able to frame a common basis of conversation. So I think the first thing when we try to talk to people who we don't share, a worldview with, and particularly I think, I would suspect that a lot of people who are in the University of Chicago, Harper lecture talk are pretty strong on the rationalist side of the spectrum. Maybe not everyone, but if you're trying to talk to somebody who seems to have beliefs that are just inexplicable to you, maybe understand what purpose those beliefs are serving. Remember, all of our beliefs are tools for us. They're just tools that we use to navigate through the world. And we may use those tools because we're trying to organize ourselves and understand the world in a rational way, or we may be using tools that help us with our emotions and our emotional responses to the world. And so, trying to use a rationalist tool to somebody who's looking for an emotional response is just not going to work. And what you need to do is, I think it's the first step, is just acknowledging their emotional source of their beliefs. The second idea that I've had on this, and it works sometimes and less others. And a lot of times when I give this talk, I have people come up who say, well, I believe in this conspiracy theory. I believe in that conspiracy theory. And, don't call me intuitionist, you pointy-headed intellectual, get out of my face. And so when I try to communicate with them, one thing I found that's sometimes useful is say, okay, your beliefs are tools. What is this belief doing for you? If you really believe that the government, intentionally spread COVID, and you're going to work with that belief, where's that belief going to take you? Where does it go? Where does it end up for you? And when you instead of challenging the belief head on, or the veracity of the belief, if you just sort of say, okay, well, what's the utility of this belief? Really, how is it helping you in any way? And sometimes that can kind of open up an avenue for conversation and dialogue that otherwise, might not exist.
Thank you. Yeah. We'll give that a shot.
Good luck.
So one direction of questions that I've seen a few times in the Q&A is about whether the U.S. is distinctive in this regard, whether you've run any of these surveys in other countries or compared the prevalence of intuitionism, cross-nationally.
Sure, I have not run the Intuitionism Scale. It's been run by some other survey outfits. The problem is like some of the items are, I think, culturally specific to the United States. So I don't know if people in Europe are triggered by Charles Manson in the same way, for example, or they know what a nickel is. But what I do know is if you look at surveys of, say, for example, conspiracy theories and magical thinking, it does vary across the world. And, when I give these talks in Europe, if I'm in Northern Europe, the Scandinavians pride themselves on their rationality, and they're said, well, of course we are, we're rationalists, and those Italians, well, of course they're intuitionists because they're all fiery passionate. And there's a lot of these sort of stereotypes that get trafficked in. But I think the U.S. is probably much stronger on an intuitionism side than at least Northern Europe is. And I think it comes from the fact that we have this very, very strong evangelical Christian tradition here. But if you go to Africa, South America, Asia, you can find conspiracy theories, and the culture is rife with ideas about witchcraft, conspiracy theories, magical beliefs. They're replete. The evidence of intuitionist thinking is really, really strong, and of course it is, because all of these are countries that don't have necessarily resources that promote a rationalist framework. And they probably have cultural traditions that are based upon intuitions and thrive on intuitions and reinforce them. So you can look at any number of countries and you can probably find burgeoning intuitionist movements. And even in the most rationalist places like a Denmark or a Sweden, you'll still find, your strong intuitionists who are believing in homeopathy and natural remedies and are, and I think we saw this with COVID, sort of the level of vaccine resistance in these countries that we probably wouldn't have expected it to arise in, is, I think, indicative of the power of intuitions in these places.
So one of the things you touched on there is sort of differences in how an educational experience might shape a person's tendency to rely upon intuitionist versus rationalist thinking in different pieces of life. And so I guess moving to more public policy level questions, what would you say is the prescription for where we are right now in the United States?
This is a really hard thing to know what to do about. I think the big problem for us from a public policy standpoint is not intuitionism. It's the fact that we need to have more worldview diversity across the ideological spectrum. If I could do anything right now, it would be to empower rationalist conservatives and to have them have a stronger voice in terms of talking about how we should be framing our public discourse, and to bring, I think democracy is a rationalist institution. If you go back and you look at the Federalist Papers, Madison is entirely apprehensive about intuitions. It's all about, and the whole structure of government is designed to kind of thwart the power of intuitions. And they realize that democracy, modern democracy, is the product of the Enlightenment. It's the product of a reason-based orientation, and it's fragile in that way. And it requires people who are in positions of political leadership to really, I think, be committed to rational political discourse, because that's the only way we could have kind of common discourse across the spectrum. Those groups that rely on emotions and gut feelings, they're difficult to, it's a difficult divide to cross. Political rhetoric always has a lot of emotional elements to it, but when one political side becomes so dominated by this intuitionist framework, I think that's when we're in a moment of political peril. And I was apprehensive about this in 2016, and I was very, very apprehensive in the period following the 2020 election, and the life given to just blatantly false claims about, say, for example, election fraud, and the way that would animate a group, that they would actually attack the Capitol. Probably for me, as a political scientist, but as an American, is the most sacred moment, which is what really defines our democracy, which is this peaceful transfer of power that happens. And to have that attacked, and to have that attack condoned by so many, is just, to me, that's the really problematic aspect. If I could do anything in our political sphere right now, it would be that. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So I think I've been told we've got time for one more question. And unfortunately, for those of you who've asked questions that we haven't been able to get to, there are over 160 questions that have been waiting in the queue. And yeah, there's just been a lot of interest. Thank you for that, because it's been a really fascinating talk. But just to finish off, I was wondering if you'd say a little bit about, so we've got another election cycle coming up, and then another presidential election quite soon. How do you think this is going to go?
I hate forecasting the future. I'm not, if I could forecast the future, I would, I'd be a hedge fund manager or something. I don't know. I am concerned more so than at any point in my adult life about the strains that are being placed on our democratic processes right now. And I think it's not just intuitionism. It's a whole host of other factors that are involved, particularly the polarization of our political parties, the polarization of our media environment. And I don't see that going away anytime soon, particularly the strains of COVID the uncertainty of our global situation right now. These are situations when people are facing a lot of uncertainty. These is what makes people scared. And when people are scared, they're looking for quick answers to make their fears go away. And it's into that space where intuitionist political rhetoric and intolerance really rises. So I wish I had a hopeful message right now, but right now my message is one of concern. And I think my response to that would be, it's time for, if anyone else is similarly concerned, this is a moment to become politically engaged, if you have not, about this, because I really do see our system of government, which I am very, very committed to, as being under great strain. And it's going to be incumbent upon citizens who are supportive of democracy and democratic norms to step up, no matter where they are on the ideological spectrum, and to support those norms.
Thank you very much. And I think that's all the time we have.
Thank you, Professor Oliver, for sharing your work with us. That was fascinating. And thank you, Dr. McCall, for being here to extend the conversation. We're so sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. There were so many, and thank you so much for being here tonight and for submitting them. For more from Professor Oliver, check out the 9 Questions podcast coming soon in 2022. Every episode, he'll be interviewing a phenomenal guests, and listeners will get to hear how some of our bravest, wisest, and most interesting fellow humans answer the 9 questions to know themselves better. So check out www.9-questions.com/podcast. You can also listen to Professor Oliver's UChicago Big Brains podcast, episode 25, The Science of Conspiracy Theories and Political Polarization. Visit bigbrains.uchicago.edu. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.